Normandy, France, June 6, 1944, somewhere past 1:30 in the morning. 25-year-old First Sergeant Leonard Funk hits the ground hard, 20 miles from where he is supposed to be. His ankle is already swelling inside his jump boot. Around him there is nothing but hedgerow shadow, unfamiliar French pasture, and the sound of C-47 engines fading north. He is a clerk from Braddock Township, Pennsylvania. Before all this, a high school graduate who worked behind a counter before the draft found him in 1941. Now he is alone in occupied France with a folding stock rifle, a handful of strangers gathering in the dark, and a Thompson submachine gun slung across his chest. He checks the weapon by feel. Bolt handle. Selector, the 30-round box magazine seated flush. No drum rattling against his hip. The Army took care of that particular problem before he ever boarded the plane. He does not know the paperwork behind that decision. He only knows the gun in his hands works, and that it will need to. 18 other paratroopers find him in the dark, as lost as he is. Bunk takes charge. For the rest of that night, and into the next day, limping on a sprained ankle, he leads them through hedgerow country toward American lines. It will earn him a Silver Star before the sun sets on his first day in France. It will not be his last engagement with this weapon, and it will not be the moment that matters most to this story. That comes later, in the snow, in a different country. But it starts here, in a Norman field, with a broken ankle and a gun that does not fail him. Across the hedgerows, the men waiting for him carried a different set of assumptions into that night. German infantry doctrine in 1944 still leaned heavily on the rifle and the machine gun team. The idea that a disciplined squad, anchored by an MG-42, laying down a wall of fire, could outrange and out-organize whatever the Americans threw at short distance. Automatic pistols and submachine guns were treated in German training literature as a secondary. Close-in tool. Useful for clearing a trench or a room, but never the backbone of an infantry fight. What German soldiers did not expect, moving hedgerow to hedgerow and farmhouse to farmhouse through the Norman bocage, was how often the fight would collapse to 15, 10, 5 yards. The exact range band, where a handheld weapon capable of pouring out hundreds of rounds a minute, stopped being an auxiliary tool and became the deciding factor. Here is the thing about this weapon that almost nobody tells you correctly. The Thompson is one of the most famous firearms in American history, famous enough that it has its own nickname, its own gangster mythology, its own place in 50 years of movies. But the real story of why it worked so well in the hedgerows and villages of France has almost nothing to do with any of that. It has to do with two mistakes. One of those mistakes was real. It was documented, tested, argued over in memos nobody outside a small office in Washington would ever read, and fixed before this weapon reached a single beach in Normandy. The other mistake was never real at all. It was a story soldiers told each other in the dark, repeated in 100 bars and 1,000 war movies since, and it has survived for 80 years, despite having no basis in the physics of combat or a single verified enemy account. The difference in how the United States Army treated these two problems, the one that was true and the one that was not, is the entire reason this weapon earned the reputation it has. Don't expect me to tell you which is which yet. Hold that thought. To understand how a slow, heavy first-generation weapon born out of the trenches of the First World War became a soldier's most trusted tool in the Second, we have to go back to a Kentucky-born artillery officer who never once in his entire military career expected to be remembered for a gun that fires from the hip. John Taliaferro Thompson was born on December 31, 1860, in Newport, Kentucky, the son of an Army colonel. There was no factory floor in his childhood, no tinkerer's workbench, no origin story out of a boy's adventure novel. He was raised the way career military children are raised, moving post to post, absorbing the rhythms of a military family, deciding by the age of 16 that soldiering would be his life. He spent a year at Indiana University before securing an appointment to West Point in 1877, graduating in 1882, 11th in a class of 37. What makes Thompson interesting is not a spark of teenage genius. It is 4 decades of unglamorous, competent staff work inside the U.S. Army's ordnance bureaucracy. He shifted from the artillery into the Ordnance Department in 1890 and stayed there, effectively, for the rest of his life. During the Spanish-American War, he ran munitions logistics into Cuba for General William Shafter's Cuban campaign. More than 18,000 tons of material moved without a single serious accident, at a time when the rest of the Army's supply system was, by most accounts, in near chaos. That performance made him the youngest colonel in the Army at the time. It also gave him his first real exposure to automatic weapons when he arranged, on his own authority, for a Gatling gun detachment to support the assault at San Juan Hill. By 1907, he was effectively running small arms development and production for the Ordnance Department. He was a bureaucrat with a battlefield sense of what a soldier actually needed, not a garage inventor, but an institutional insider who had watched trench warfare in Europe and concluded that the bolt-action rifle, the standard infantry weapon of every major army in 1915, was the wrong tool for clearing a trench at close range. He wanted what he called a trench broom, a lightweight, fully automatic weapon a single soldier could carry and fire from the hip, sweeping an enemy position the way a broom clears a floor. The mechanical problem was operating that weapon safely without the weight and complexity of a full machine gun action. Thompson found his answer in a 1915 patent belonging to a U.S. Navy officer, John Bell Blish, who had observed that dissimilar metals under high pressure would briefly lock together before slipping apart as pressure dropped. A delayed blowback principle that, in theory, let a lighter weapon handle a powerful cartridge safely. Thompson brought Blish in as a partner, secured financial backing from New York financier Thomas F. Ryan, and founded the Auto Ordnance Company in 1916. The early results were a disappointment before they were a triumph. Thompson's first design used the 3306 rifle cartridge and the Blish lock together, and testing showed the round was simply too powerful for the mechanism to handle reliably. His design team, engineers Theodore Eickhoff, Oscar Payne, and George Gall, pivoted to the 45 EP pistol cartridge already standardized for the Colt M1911, and by 1918 had a testable prototype nicknamed the Annihilator. It arrived exactly 1 war too late. The first shipment of prototypes reached the New York docks for shipment to Europe on November 11, 1918, the day the war ended. Thompson is reported to have said, on hearing the news, that it looked like they had missed the boat. They renamed the weapon at a 1919 board meeting Thompson submachine gun, the first firearm in history to carry that label in its own marketing, even though the German MP-18 had beaten it into actual combat by several months. It was patented in 1920. The first production model, the model of 1921, came off Colt's line in March of that year. 15,000 units, hand-finished, blued steel, walnut furniture, priced at $200 apiece, the equivalent of well over $3,000 today. At that price, in a country with no appetite for another war, it sold badly. While Adolf Hitler was still an obscure figure in Bavarian beer hall politics and Japan's military expansion into Manchuria was still more than a decade away, Thompson's weapon was being marketed, with limited success, to police departments, banks, and the United States Postal Inspection Service, which bought roughly 200 of them in 1926 to guard against a wave of mail train robberies. It was that same weapon, cheap to obtain on the civilian market throughout the 1920s, because of poor sales, not despite them, that fell into the hands of Prohibition-era gangsters and gave the Thompson its lasting, misleading cultural image, the gun that supposedly made the 20s roar, associated forever afterward with Al Capone and John Dillinger, more than with the soldiers who would eventually depend on it. Underneath the gangster mythology, though, a real mechanical flaw was quietly documented by the very institutions testing this weapon for legitimate military and law enforcement use, years before Normandy. The Blish lock, the delayed blowback heart of the design Thompson had bought from a Navy officer in 1915, was a complicated, closely fitted mechanism with a wedge-shaped locking piece that depended on precise tolerances to function. It added weight, cost, and moving parts to a weapon that was supposed to be simple. Worse, the 50-round drum magazine that gave the Thompson its most recognizable silhouette, the magazine every gangster movie still shows, attached and detached by sliding sideways into the receiver. A slow and finicky process that made clearing even a minor malfunction agonizing under pressure. Loading it required winding the internal spring against resistance until armorers counted 9 to 11 distinct clicks before the magazine was safe to seat. In the controlled environment of a police range or a Nicaragua jungle patrol against lightly armed insurgents, this was tolerable. Under mud, sand, rain, and the shaking of a long forced march, it was not. What most militaries, historically, have done when they discover this kind of flaw in a weapon they have already committed to and already shipped in bulk is straightforward. They keep the weapon in service, issue a maintenance bulletin, tell the troops to be careful, and quietly plan to replace it whenever the next procurement cycle allows. That is the ordinary institutional response: patch, endure, replace later. What the United States Army's Ordnance Department chose to do instead, in the years just before American troops set foot in France, was something rarer. To understand exactly what that choice was, and why it mattered so much more than it should have for a piece of paper signed in an office nobody in the field would ever see, we need to go inside that office. There is no dramatic single date carved on a monument for this part of the story, because the man responsible for it did his work the way most consequential ordnance decisions get made, in committee, across years, in a windowless building in Washington, D.C. His name was Ren R. Studler. Studler was not a designer in the romantic sense. He was a career ordnance officer, an Ohio State graduate with a master's degree in engineering from MIT, who had spent the 1920s and 1930s as exactly the kind of anonymous troubleshooter no war movie has ever made about: proof officer at Aberdeen Proving Ground, commander of an ordnance depot in the Philippines, military attached watching European arms development firsthand from a posting in London between 1936 and 1940. In 1940, with war already raging in Europe, he was recalled to Washington to become chief of the Small Arms Division in the Office of the Chief of Ordnance. He would hold that post for the next 13 years, becoming the single most powerful gatekeeper of what weapons the American soldier would and would not carry into the field. The same officer who would later champion the M1 carbine and drive the M3 grease gun into production. Almost nobody outside his own directorate knew his name. Almost every rifle, carbine, and submachine gun an American soldier carried in Europe passed across his desk in some form. What Studler's Ordnance Directorate confronted in 1940 and 1941 was a weapon procurement crisis dressed up as an opportunity. Orders were suddenly flooding in. 3,000 M1928 Thompsons for France in the fall of 1939 before the country's collapse, further orders from Britain and Sweden, and then, after Pearl Harbor. An American army that needed to arm hundreds of thousands of soldiers with a submachine gun that had, until that point, been treated as a barely tolerated auxiliary weapon. The gun that answered to those orders, the M1928A1, was still built the expensive, old way, finned barrel, cuts compensator, the delicate Blish lock, compatibility with the troublesome drum. Confirmation of the drum's failures was already arriving from the field. In North Africa, Commonwealth troops issued Lend-Lease M1928s discovered the weapon jamming badly in blowing desert sand. Unit armorers began physically removing the Blish lock altogether, replacing it with a simple fixed hex bolt, and welding shut the peepholes on the 20-round box magazines to keep grit out, discarding the 50-round drums entirely as a lost cause in that terrain. The document that mattered, in the end, was not one dramatic memo, but a running series of Ordnance Committee actions across 1941 and early 1942. Technical committee minutes, weighed and reweighed, that did something most armies at war do not have the discipline to do. They stopped defending the original design and simplified it instead. The fix, worked out under Studler's Directorate, was almost brutally clinical. Strip out the Blish lock's H-piece entirely and let the weapon operate as a straightforward blowback gun, heavier bolt, simpler tolerances, none of the delicate wedge-locking mechanism that jammed in grit. Eliminate the finned barrel and the cuts compensator. Replace the complex adjustable rear sight with a simple fixed L-type sight. Drop drum compatibility altogether, restricting the weapon to the box magazine that had already proven itself more reliable in the field. In April 1942, this simplified weapon was officially designated the Thompson submachine gun, caliber .45, M1A, further refinements soon after. Machining the firing pin directly into the face of the bolt instead of using a separate part, produced the M1A1, the version that would ship to Normandy. Here is the comparison that actually matters, because almost every major army fighting World War II had a comparable documented flaw in a mainline weapon, and almost none of them handled it the way the U.S. Ordnance Department handled the Thompson. The Wehrmacht's Karabiner 98K rifle had a well-documented tendency toward extraction problems when its action fouled with mud and cold in Eastern Front conditions, and it stayed in first-line production, largely unmodified, until the war's end, kept. The Soviet Red Army's semi-automatic Tokarev, SVT-40, suffered chronic reliability failures in the field. Dirt and moisture jamming its gas system in ways troops openly distrusted, and production continued regardless, with soldiers frequently reverting to older bolt-action rifles by preference, kept the Imperial Japanese Army's Arisaka rifles, as raw material shortages worsened late in the war, saw metallurgical quality decline in ways ordnance inspectors flagged internally, and the rifles kept shipping to units in the Pacific regardless, kept the United States Army facing a comparable structural problem in its own submachine gun, stopped the assembly line's old configuration, and rebuilt it. The production numbers tell you how seriously this was taken. Auto Ordnance and Savage Arms had already built well over 500,000 of the older M1928A1 pattern, 562,511 units, by the final wartime tally, before the simplified M1 configuration fully displaced it on the line, beginning around July 1942. Retooling 2 working factory floors mid-contract. In the middle of the largest military mobilization in American history, to remove a mechanism that had defined the weapons operation for 2 decades was not a trivial administrative choice. It meant new fixtures, new inspection gauges, new training for machinists who had spent months fitting Blish locks to exacting tolerances, and it meant accepting weeks of reduced output at a moment when every submachine gun mattered. Studler's directorate absorbed that cost anyway, because a documented field failure under combat conditions outweighed the inconvenience of a mid-war retool. The quiet conclusion of this part of the story is simple, and it does not need to be shouted to land. If that series of 1941 and 1942 ordnance decisions had not happened, if the Army had kept shipping the old Blish lock, drum-compatible M1A1 configuration the way Germany kept shipping its flawed Kar-98K, and the Soviet Union kept shipping its flawed SVT-40, the weapon Leonard Funk carried off that C-47 into the hedgerows of Normandy in June 1944 would have been a different, heavier, more failure-prone gun. In the exact terrain where fights collapsed to point-blank range in seconds, that difference would have mattered enormously. Before any of this paid off, there was real institutional skepticism about whether a submachine gun belonged in a modern army at all. Well into the interwar years, American infantry doctrine treated the submachine gun the way most conservative militaries did, as a specialized, secondary weapon for military police, tank crews, and rear area security, not a frontline infantry tool. Some ordnance evaluators in the 1930s worried openly, in internal correspondence, that the weapon's stubby range and its appetite for ammunition made it a liability rather than an asset outside of close urban combat, and its cost per unit, even after the M1/M1A1 simplification, around $45, several times the cost of the sheet metal M3 that would later be developed specifically as its cheaper replacement, made ordnance planners uneasy about mass issuing it at all. This is precisely why the M3 grease gun program existed in parallel. Studler's own directorate was simultaneously trying to replace the Thompson with something even cheaper. Evidence that nobody inside ordnance treated the Thompson's success as guaranteed. The unit that put the simplified M1A1 to its clearest test in France was the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, part of the 82nd Airborne Division, which jumped into Normandy in the early hours of June 6, 1944. Among them was First Sergeant Leonard Funk of Company C, 25 years old, a former retail clerk from Braddock Township, Pennsylvania, drafted in June 1941 before Pearl Harbor, and a volunteer for the still-new airborne program soon after. He was not a competition marksman or a farmer's son with a rifle since childhood. He was, by his own record, an ordinary enlisted man who had trained hard and jumped often, standing barely 5.5 feet tall, the kind of soldier no scout would single out in a photograph. Picture the hedgerow country west of Saint-Amour-Glise in the days after the initial landing. It is early June 1944. The bocage terrain is a maze of sunken lanes and thick earthen banks topped with hedges centuries old, each field a natural fortress no larger than a city block. German infantry doctrine, trained around the Kar-98K rifle and the MG-42 machine gun's devastating long sight lines, expects to fight at range, to let a machine gun team pin an advancing squad in open ground and let riflemen finish the job from cover. The hedgerows destroy that plan before it starts. Sight lines collapse to 15 yards, sometimes 5. American paratroopers, scattered far from their intended drop zones, and moving in small, improvised groups, exactly like the 18-man Team Funk assembled that first night. Find themselves fighting not at rifle range, but at pistol range, hedge to hedge, farmhouse to farmhouse. This is where the math of the M1A1 does the talking. A German rifleman working a Kar 98K bolt action can put out perhaps 10 to 15 aimed rounds a minute under pressure. An MG-42 team, devastating in open country, needs seconds to reposition and relay its sights when the fight suddenly closes to 15 yards inside a sunken lane. A paratrooper coming through a hedgerow gap with an M1A1 Thompson set to automatic can empty a 30-round box magazine in under 4 seconds. In the close, blind, fast-breaking engagements the Bocage forced on both sides, that difference in raw rounds per second at point-blank range was often the entire fight. German after-action patterns from the Bocage campaign, reflected in post-war interrogations of Wehrmacht veterans compiled by Allied historical teams, repeatedly describe the shock of American patrols that seemed to produce far more automatic fire than their numbers should have allowed. Not machine gun nests, just a handful of paratroopers with handheld weapons pouring out fire at a rate German small unit doctrine had not trained anyone to expect from an infantry squad that size. The small human detail that tells you everything about how soldiers actually felt about this weapon is what they did with the ones that didn't belong to them. Thompsons were chronically in short supply relative to demand inside-line infantry units, and paratroopers and rangers borrowed, the polite word used at the time, Thompsons from mortar squads and support troops whenever they could get away with it, because the weapon was disproportionately prized for exactly the kind of close-range patrol and raiding work the airborne divisions specialized in. Nobody had to order a soldier to carry a Thompson. Men fought to get one, and once they had it, they did not give it back without a fight of their own. Funk's own night on June 6th and into June 7th is the clean, small-scale proof of the pattern. 20 miles from his drop zone, his ankle swollen from a hard landing, he assembled 18 scattered paratroopers in the dark and led them, on foot, back to American lines through territory still contested by German patrols, the same hedgerow terrain, the same close-range risk, night after night. He came out the other side of it with a Silver Star and a reputation, inside his own regiment, as a first sergeant who did not lose his composure when a fight came apart. The weapon slung across his chest through all of it worked exactly as the men in Washington had redesigned it to work, simplified, reliable, unglamorous, ready. The strategic payoff of the redesigned Thompson's performance in Normandy was not a single captured hill or airfield. It was cumulative, the successful establishment and expansion of the American lodgment inland from the invasion, beaches through weeks of hedgerow fighting that German commanders had hoped would bog the Allies down indefinitely. Every close quarters clearing action in that Bocage country, multiplied across thousands of small unit engagements through June and July of 1944, added up to the breakout that would eventually carry the U.S. Army out of Normandy and across France. The Thompson did not win that campaign alone, but in the specific terrain where it mattered most, inside 15 yards, inside a sunken lane, inside a farmhouse doorway, it did exactly what a decade of institutional testing and one hard 1941 redesign had built it to do. Here is the legend, and if you have watched enough war movies, you already know it by heart. A soldier flips the Thompson's selector switch from safe to full automatic, or racks the bolt to chamber around, and somewhere in the dark, an enemy soldier hears the distinctive metallic click of the mechanism and knows, instantly, exactly what is coming, knows to duck, to dive, to open fire first. Because that specific sound is a death sentence a half-second away. It shows up in dialogue, in memoirs written secondhand, in barroom arguments among people who never carried the weapon themselves. It is a wonderful piece of dramatic shorthand because it turns a mechanical detail into a moment of pure tension, the click in the dark that changes everything. Now let's take it apart properly, because it does not survive contact with the evidence. On 3 separate fronts. Start with the acoustics. Combat in the hedgerows and streets of 1944 France was not a quiet space where a single metallic click could carry cleanly across a battlefield. It was artillery, rumbling in the distance, small arms fire cracking and echoing off stone farmhouse walls. Engines, shouted orders, the specific hard snap of a Kar 98K round breaking the sound barrier a few feet from your head. Acoustic studies of small arms mechanical noise consistently show that a selector switch or bolt movement produces a sound in the range of perhaps 60 to 70 decibels at close distance, audible in a silent room, essentially unrecoverable against a combat soundscape where gunfire alone regularly exceeds 150 decibels at the muzzle. The physics simply does not support the idea that this specific click was distinguishable at any meaningful distance over everything else happening at the same moment. Even granting, for argument's sake, that an enemy soldier somehow isolated that sound, the tactical math still does not work. The interval between a soldier flipping a selector switch or racking a bolt and that same soldier firing is a fraction of a second, not the 2 or 3 seconds of dramatic hesitation the legend requires. There is no realistic window in which an enemy soldier hears a click, processes what it means, decides on a response, and executes that response before the shooting has already started. Combat reaction times, measured across decades of military psychology research, run in the quarter to half-second range under ideal conditions, nowhere close to enough time to convert a mechanical noise into a life-saving tactical decision. And the documentary record simply is not there. No captured German training manual instructs soldiers to listen for a Thompson selector click as a combat cue. No verified post-war interrogation of a Wehrmacht veteran, among the substantial archive of debriefs collected by Allied military intelligence and later by historians working through captured German and American after-action files, describes this specific listening tactic as something soldiers were taught or practiced. Researchers combing through National Archives ordnance and combat report collections, and small arms historians who have spent careers on Thompson production and combat records, have never surfaced a documented instance of this tactic being used or taught. It appears nowhere except in second-hand American storytelling. None of this means the soldiers who believed it were foolish, and it is worth saying plainly why the myth survived so well for so long. Combat is an environment of extreme, constant uncertainty, where a soldier's brain is desperately searching for any pattern that might explain why one man lived and another died in the same firefight. In that kind of paranoia, folklore fills gaps that official doctrine simply does not cover, a comforting, ordered explanation for chaos that is, in reality, mostly noise and luck. A story about a telltale click gives soldiers something they can imagine controlling. That is a deeply human response to the terror of combat, not a failure of intelligence or courage. And here, finally, is the point this entire film has been building toward. The real flaw in this weapon, the Blischlock's fragility, the drum magazine's unreliability in mud and sand, was documented in ordnance reports, argued over in committee, tested at proving grounds, and physically redesigned out of the weapon before a single M1A1 Thompson reached Normandy. The imagined flaw, the myth of the telltale click, was never fixed, was never the subject of a single Ordnance Committee meeting, was never mentioned in a single technical bulletin, because it never needed to be. It was never real. Call it institutional discipline, if you want a name for it. The same organization, rigorous enough to strip a working weapon down to its frame over a documented sand jamming problem in the North African desert, was also disciplined enough to spend 0 hours and $0 chasing a threat that existed only in campfire storytelling. That is the real thesis of this story. Fixing the true problem and ignoring the false one both required the same quality: the willingness to trust evidence over instinct in both directions. The clearest, largest test of everything this weapon and this redesign had built toward came 7 months after Normandy, in the depths of the Battle of the Bulge. On January 29, 1945, in the small Belgian village of Holsheim, Leonard Funk, now First Sergeant, acting executive officer of Company C, after his lieutenant became a casualty, led a scratch platoon of company clerks and headquarters personnel 15 miles through a driving snowstorm into an assault against 15 German-occupied houses. His scratch unit and the regiment's 3rd platoon cleared every house without taking a single casualty, netting roughly 80 German prisoners in the process. Then, with only 4 guards available to watch that many prisoners while the rest of the company pushed on to clear remaining resistance, a larger German patrol overran the guard detail, freed the captives, and prepared to hit Company C from the rear. Funk walked around the corner of a building directly into the middle of it, surrounded by more than 80 armed and rearmed German soldiers, ordered to surrender at gunpoint by the German officer in command. He began, visibly, to comply, slowly unslinging his Thompson from his shoulder as if surrendering it. Then, in one motion, he brought the weapon into line and fired a full 30-round magazine into the German officer and the soldiers immediately around him, shouting for the other American guards to grab whatever weapons they could reach. In the chaotic seconds that followed, 21 German soldiers were killed, dozens more wounded, and the rest recaptured. Company C held Holsheim. For that action, President Harry Truman awarded Leonard Funk the Medal of Honor on September 5, 1945, at the White House. Trace the full chain, and it runs cleanly from one end to the other. A Kentucky-born ordnance officer's decades of unglamorous staff work and a 1915 Navy patent produced a workable trench weapon 2 decades too late for the war it was built for. A documented field failure, a fragile lock, and an unreliable drum magazine was caught, argued over, and physically redesigned out of the weapon by Rensselaer's Ordnance Directorate in 1941 and 1942, at real cost to wartime production schedules. That redesigned weapon, the M1A1, reached the hedgerows of Normandy in the hands of paratroopers like Leonard Funk in June 1944, performed exactly as its point-blank, high-volume design intended, and armed the same soldier 7 months later when he needed every one of those 30 rounds in under 2 seconds to survive being surrounded by 80 enemy soldiers in a Belgian farmyard. Remove any single link in that chain, the redesign never happens, the weapon jams in the cold, Funk does not get the shot off first, and the story ends differently. The most credible endorsement this weapon ever received came not from a general's press release, but from the men who had no reason to flatter it. Infantry officers who fought through the Italian campaign and the liberation of France, describing the weapon in post-war recollections and oral histories gathered by military historians, consistently singled out its dependability in exactly the conditions where lesser weapons failed: rain, mud, the relentless grind of a long campaign, as the quality that mattered most, more than raw firepower on a range. John Thompson himself never lived to see any of it. He died of a heart attack on June 21st, 1940, at 79 years old, more than a year before Pearl Harbor, and 4 years before his weapon proved itself in the country his own ordnance career had once supplied through the chaos of an earlier war. In his final years, by his own written reflection, he was troubled that the weapon bearing his name had become better known for its criminal misuse in the 1920s and 1930s than for the soldiers it was actually built to protect. He never received significant personal wealth from the weapon's wartime success. Auto ordnance had passed out of his direct control years before the Army placed its largest orders, and it was his successors and the company's later owners who profited from the war years. More than 1.5 million Thompsons of all variants were built before production ended in 1944. A scale Thompson himself, watching sales collapse in the 1920s, could never have imagined. Today, more than 80 years after the M1A1 first crossed a beach in Normandy, competitive shooters still gather at ranges across the United States to fire semi-automatic Thompson descendants in historical military rifle matches, a weapon born to break a trench stalemate in 1918, still earning its keep on a firing line in the present day. What this story actually teaches has less to do with any one gun and more to do with institutions, and the discipline it takes to be honest with yourself about which problems are real. Most organizations, under wartime pressure, default to defending decisions they have already made. The rarer and harder thing is what the U.S. Ordnance Department did here twice. Once when it tore a working weapon apart over a documented field failure nobody outside a small office would ever know about. And once when it refused to spend a single hour chasing a threat that never existed outside of soldiers' fear in the dark. Getting both of those calls right, in the same weapon, in the same short window, before Normandy, is the actual mistake this story is named for, the mistake of assuming the two flaws were equally real, when only one of them was. If your own family carries a story from this war, a father, a grandfather, an uncle who came home and never said much about it, tell us below which unit, which island, which river, which French or Belgian village. Those details are disappearing from living memory faster than most of us want to admit, and they belong somewhere more permanent than a kitchen table conversation. Somewhere near the Elbe River, in the spring of 1945, the war finally behind him in every direction that mattered, Leonard Funk still carries the same reflex he carried out of that Norman hedgerow 11 months earlier. The instinct to listen past the noise for whatever sound might actually mean something, and to trust, by then, that most of what he'd once feared in the dark had never been real at all.